Economic hitman John Perkins described in similar terms. His job was to justify huge international loans that would funnel money to U.S. companies like Bechtel, Halliburton, Stone and Webster, and Brown and Root, those massive engineering and construction projects. At the same time, he would work to bankrupt the country that received those loans after they have paid U.S. contractors, of course, so they would be forever beholden to their creditors, and so they would present easy targets when we needed them favors, including military bases, UN votes, or access to oil and other natural resources. And I quote, the unspoken aspect of every one of these projects was they were intended to create large profits for the contractors and to make a handful of wealthy and influential families in the receiving countries very happy, while assuring the long-term financial independence and therefore the political loyalty of the government around the world. The larger the loans, the better. The fact that the debt burden placed on a country will deprive its poor citizens of wealth, health, education, and other social services for decades to come was not taken into consideration. End quote. Ideally, as Holly Sclera points out, the corporation ruling class prefers the more insidious styles of debt diplomacy. She gives the example of the IMF breaking Michael Manley's democratic socialist program in Jamaica, the more naked use of force of the patterns of the Chilean coup scenario. But at the intermediate level, the United States also has intelligent resources of fairly low-key covert action, and for assistance the counterinsurgency campaign by friendly juntas. The nation's security community's capability for low-level intervention interacting synergistically with carrot and stick of debt diplomacy serves admirably in allowing the U.S. to replace unfriendly regimes without the political risks associated with direct military intervention. Charles Plater's The Debt Trap is an excellent survey of the use of debt crisis to force countries into standby arrangement, facilitate coups, or provoke military crackdowns. She provides case studies of the Tubarão coup, the overthrow of the Goulart in Brazil, the Pinochet coup, and the Marcos Declaration of Martial Law. Waldo Bellows' The Development Debacle is a more in-depth case study of the Philippines, based on the extensive documentation of World Bank collaboration with Marcos and his authoritarian crackdown, giving him a free hand in imposing an austerity program, politically impossible against a background of free elections. One colorful example of the use of economic weapons against a rebellious vassal can be found in the Nixon administration's discussion of Chile. The goal, in Nixon's own words, was to make the Chilean economy scream, with total financial and economic embargo coupled with the exploitation of friendly ties to the military. As the ambassador Edward Corey warned the Chileans, not a knot or boat shall reach Chile under Allende. Once Allende comes to power, we shall do all within our power to condemn Chile and all Chileans to almost deprivation and poverty. As the Chilean example suggests, U.S. ties and military assistance to foreign military forces can be quite effective. When brought to bear in combination with economic warfare, the objectives of military assistance become clear when we see against whom it is directed. Mao's weapon in Military Aid and Counter-Revolution in the Third World provide a list of the military or executive depictions of political targets of the military assistance program, based on the systematic review of congressional hearings on the program. Neutralism, leftist revolution, forced disruption, nationalism, radical states, homegrown insurgents, insurgencies in Mexico to U.S. interests, political instability, extremist elements, political dissidents, insurgents, state-sponsored terrorism and their allies, other extremists, radical elements, radical revolutionaries, Arab nationalism, revolutionary ideas, leftists, ultra-nationalists, anti-American Nasser types, and Methodists. Government circles repeatedly make clear the main purpose of the military assistance program was to secure internal political and economic orientation favorable to the U.S. interests, not to assist in external defense. The NSC paper, Overseas Internal Defense Policy in August 1962, for example, has stated, a change brought about through force by non-communist elements may be preferable to prolonged deterioration of governmental effectiveness. It is U.S. policy what is in the U.S. interest to make the local military and police advocacy of democracy and anxious for carry forward the development progress. End quote. In congressional hearings of force assistance in Indonesia and Laos in the 1960s, spokesmen for the military assistance program drew a clear distinction between building up or cultivating friendships of an army on one hand and supporting the army's government. In Cologai with Representative Rancer in 1971, Undersecretary of Defense for International Security Affairs another emphasized the importance of military assistance in establishing ties with third world military leaders as a means of influencing internal events, sometimes by the deliberate destabilization of unfriendly regimes. Mr. Nasser in some of these countries or provide assistance to the side they have seized the power. Secretary Nodder, in his statement, we feel it is extremely important to maintain our relations with the people who are in positions of influence in those countries so we can help influence the course of events. Mr. Fraser, in your judgment, national security in the United States means internal stability in those countries. Is that right? Secretary Nodder, not always. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. It means maintaining our influence in some areas of the world that are critical to our security. It means helping to promote as best we can the developments that are most in our national interest, but does not necessarily mean providing for the internal security of those countries. Sometimes it does. End quote. The policy community and associate policy intellectuals also indicate that national security have more to do with U.S. economic control over resources and markets than the military defense against external attacks. Hilton B. Goss, a Defense Department associate scholar, wrote in a 1958 study on Africa, and I quote, the potential resources of Africans are needed on the side of the free world to aid in the preservation of U.S. security. A U.S. policy for Africa and Africans must be designed and implemented promptly or we shall lose Africa. To obstruct nationalism to the communists or to polarization on the basis of color versus white people of the world. End quote. In 1968, General Robert Porter, a commander-in-chief in the Southern Command, described the military assistance program as an insurance policy for private investment in Latin America. In an address to Pan American Society in New York, he said, and I quote, as final thought, consider the small amount of U.S. public funds that had gone for military assistance. As a very modest insurance policy protecting our very fast private investments in an area of tremendous trade and strategic value to our country. End quote. None of this is to say by any means that the United States policymakers like unnecessary resort to military coup or death squad regimes. The general progression of methods generally goes from the use of financial and economic power to covert aid to destabilization or repression, and only to outright military force as a weapon of last resort. As John Perkins has put it, and I quote, in countries like Ecuador, Nigeria, and Indonesia, we dress like local school teachers and shop owners. In Washington and Paris, we look like government bureaucrats and bankers. We appear humble, normal. We visit project sites and stroll through impoverished village. We profess altruism and talk with local papers about the wonderful humanitarian things we are doing. We cover the conference tables of government committees with spreadsheets and financial projections. And we lecture at the Harvard Business School about the miracles of macroeconomics. We are on the record, in the open, and so we portray ourselves, so are we accepted. It's how the systems work. We seldom resort to anything illegal because the system itself is built on subterfuge, and the system is by definition legitimate. However, there is a very large caveat. If we fail, a even more sinister breed steps in. Once we, economic hitmen, referred to as the jackals, men who trace their heritage directly to those earlier empires. The jackals are always there, lurking in the shadows. When they emerge, heads of state or overthrow, or die in violent accidents. And if by chance the jackals fail, if they fail in Afghanistan and Iraq, then the old models resurface. When the jackals fail, young Americans are set in to kill and to die. End quote. Although the policy elites are willing to resort to violence, often softened methods fail. Whenever possible, they prefer spectacle democracy in which the racial public choices is carefully managed to exclude anything touching on the real structure of economic power. According to Terry Crow, U.S. involvement in Latin America has been guided by the ideology of electoralism, which asserts that meaningful elections would channel political action into peaceful contests among elites and accord public legitimacy to the winners. For example, Thomas Carruthers explained that democracy policies in El Salvador did not touch the major power structure of the Salvadorian society, principally the military and the economic elite, which were anti-democratic. The United States had no real conception of democracy, in which the military was not the dominant actor. The economic elite no longer held the national economy in its hand. The left was incorporated into the political system, and all Salvadorians had both the former and substantial possibility of political participation. Honduran policy likewise greatly strengthened the anti-democratic military and refined a formal electoral process that did little to change the anti-democratic structural features of the society. The U.S. Central American policy was based on the belief that a country is a democracy when it has government that came to power through free and fair elections. This belief ignored the issue of how much real authority an elected government has vis-a-vis economic and military power sectors, and ignores the various dimensions of popular participation, including the free expression of opinions, day-to-day interactions between the government and the citizenry. the mobilization of interest groups, and the like. The impulse is to promote democratic change, but the underlying object is to maintain the basic order of what are quite undemocratic societies. Democracy is a means of relieving pressure for more radical changes, but only through limited top-down forms of democratic change to then not risk upsetting the traditional structure of power which the United States has long been allied. The goal of all these methods to gather what was make the American hegemony as cost-effective and politically sustainable as possible. After its direct intervention in Korea, the United States tried to minimize costs to itself by relying on a previous strategy of indirect rule through third world local elites, which committed it in turn to keeping those elites in power. The United States and Korea believed that it might to avoid massive deployment of its own troops again in the third world context by relying upon friendlier leaders and their enemies to cope with local rebellions, many of them radicals but not necessarily Leninists, aiding them with equipment, training, and funds, and turning them into proxies of American power. Annual military aid in the form of equipment, advisors, and training to nations in Latin America and Asia quadrupled under the Eisenhower and the creation of integrated regional alliances, SEATO and CENTO to begin, further tied Washington's destiny and credibility to half of its proxies. Reliance on the military as the most promising single power group in the third world nations became official policy, though this did not preclude support of the tyrants. Argumenting this dependence on officers was the United States' systematic effort to improve the ability of local policy departments to perform political functions. Public safety missions and equipment were sent to 38 countries over a 7-year period, and many people were brought from those states to undergo training in the U.S. Even more important was the great expansion of the CIA's covert activities and supremely flexible mechanisms that allowed the U.S. both to intervene in countless ways in innumerable countries and to deny responsibility in cases of embarrassment or failure. The CIA did not attempt virtually anything with impunity, and often did with great successes, as in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954, giving Washington unconventional means to become a mesh or for better or for worse in many more nations. This has been an outline of the institutional structure and general characteristics of the U.S. domination of the Third World in the post-war period, and I like the speed to categorize all the specific examples of U.S. invasions, sponsorships of coups, training and funding of death squads, and the like, and to do so will require an entire book of its own. Just listing the major examples. The overthrow of Ashburn and Mossadegh, backing for DM Saigon regime, the overthrow of Sukarno, the assassination of Lumumba, backing of Mobutu, the overthrow of Goulart, the Vietnam counterinsurgency, Operation Condor, the Pinochet coup, the Contras, the Salvadorian death squads, aid to the Mujahideen takes long enough. Besides, there already is book recounting case by case with heavy documentation of the American retro intervention for the entire post-war period. I highly recommend two books by William Ball, Kitty Hope and Rogue State. By far the most detailed books on this specific subject matter. I will highly recommend. By definition, the Kotovia requires two parties, the sudden and unexpected implosion of the Soviet bloc and then the Soviet Union itself. In 2 years' time, therefore, conclude the period under consideration. The rest of the Soviet party leadership and the leadership of the military and the KGB, Vladimir Subok writes, were blindsided by Khrushchev's willingness to dismantle the Soviet Union Eastern European sphere of control and even Communist Party rule in the Soviet Union itself. The most formidable of the conservative strongholds, the KGB, still believed in early 1987 that Khrushchev was implementing Andropov's program of controlled conservative modernization and imperial retrenchment. It did not occur to the KGB leader that Khrushchev intended to dismantle the entire regime of police repression that had survived the destabilization and become entrenched during the President Andropov years. Vladimir Khrushchev, head of the KGB branch for foreign intelligence, recalled that he had never doubted Khrushchev's devotion to the Soviet system and quote-unquote socialism, and was horrified later by the extent of his betrayal. The conservatives, the modernizers, and the military realized that the Soviet Union could ill afford its commitment on Central Europe, Afghanistan, and all over the world, and they advocate cautious retrenchment to postpone the crumbling of the Soviet sphere of influence. In contrast, Khrushchev and the New Thinkers began to proclaim a policy of non-interference in Central Europe, so they would be leaving Soviet allies completely to their own devices. Still, the Politburo majority, the KGB, and the military did not imagine that Khrushchev could be prepared to bring the Cold War to an end, and the cause of the destruction of the Soviet external empire in Central Europe and its colonies, and fatal instability in the Soviet Union itself. Absent Khrushchev's stretched reform agenda, the Soviet system most likely could have staggered along indefinitely. Instead, he unleashed massive pressure from below that brought it down. Even the economy and finances in steep decline, the Soviet Union still could hide its weak conditions behind respectable Potemkin facade and negotiate with the United States from a position of relative superiority. After 1988, this situation tragically changed. Khrushchev's decision to launch radical political and state reforms, coupled with the removal of the party apparatus from economic life, created a most severe crisis of the state and produced centrifugal political forces that spun control within Soviet society. All of this was tantamount to revolution, was vision to the world, and engulfed the Soviet leadership. This policy essentially destroyed the Soviet capacity to act like a superpower on the international arena. The Soviet Union was left in no position to bail out its allies or to present itself as an equal partner to the United States in negotiations. There were few other examples in history of a leader in charge of a huge alien state who willingly risked a geopolitical position for great power at the very foundations of political power for the sake of a moral global project. By the spring of 1989, it became obvious even to Khrushchev's closest assistants that the radical reappraisal of Soviet ideology and history initiated from above had triggered a political deluge from below, and Khrushchev himself was constitutionally incapable or unwilling to resort to force to preserve the system when it became clear it would otherwise collapse. An additional feature of Khrushchev's personality that perplexed contemporaries and witnesses was his deep aversion to the use of force. To be sure, skepticism about military force was widely shared among the new thinkers. It can also be regarded as a generational phenomenon that originated from the impact of World War II and was reinforced by the pacifist trend during the 1960s. Former Soviet Foreign Minister Anton Kryomyko, for example, privately called Khrushchev and his advisors the Martians for their ignorance of the laws of power politics. I wonder how puzzled must be the US and other NATO countries, he confessed to his son. It's a mystery for them why Khrushchev and his friends in Politburo cannot comprehend how to use force and pressure for defending their state interests. Kukovic personified the reluctant use of force. Indeed, for him it was less of a lesson from experience than a fundamental part of his character. The principle of nonviolence was a sincere belief with Khrushchev, not merely the foundation of his domestic and foreign policy, but one of his personal codes. His colleagues and assistants confirmed that the avoidance of bloodshed was a constant concern of Khrushchev, and that for Khrushchev, an unwillingness to shed blood was not only a criterion but a condition of his involvement in politics. Khrushchev, they observed, by character was a man incapable not only of using dictatorial measures, but even for resorting to hardline administrative means. The critics claimed that Khrushchev had no guts for blood, even when it was dictated by state interests. As a result, Khrushchev simply let the communist regime in Eastern Europe slip away with no intention of intervening. Without Khrushchev and his personal idiosyncrasies, the rapid disintegration of the Soviet Union itself would not have occurred. At each state of the Soviet endgame, Khrushchev made choices to destabilize the USSR and snap it straight to act coherently as a superpower. The loss of American partner in continuity left in the position of a sole superpower, a ultrapower, or hyperpower. But as the United States learned the hard way, it also left the world in many ways less governable. Kolko noted the subsequent disorder in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union itself, following the loss of the USSR as a stabilizing force. The breakdown of the Cold War tension, as Under-Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger confessed at the end of 1991, meant also loosening the control of the international system over the behavior of its constituent members. The US ultimately had to concede that the Soviet Union's stability role since 1945 had been vital to its interests, though none of its analysis ever adequately appreciated the magnitude and contribution to curbing the left since 1944 for such insight who had destroyed the very foundation of their worldview. In case of the new status quo in Eastern Europe and the former USSR itself, the enormous peril of civil wars and bloody conflicts between new and independent states, which the highest American officials had feared, began to be fulfilled immediately. For the first time since 1945, parts of Europe were again at war. Hobsbawm likewise argued that suddenly remove the props which had held up the international structure and, to the extent not yet appreciated, the structure of the world's domestic political system. What was left was the world in disarray and partial collapse, because there was nothing to replace them. The idea briefly entertained by American spokesmen that the old bipolar order could have been replaced by a new world order based on the single superpower which remained in vain, and therefore looked stronger than ever, rapidly proved unrealistic. The collapse of the communist regime between Istria and Vladivostok not only produced an enormous zone of political uncertainty, instability, chaos, and civil war, but also destroyed the international system that had stabilized international relations for some 40 years. It also revealed the precariousness of the domestic political system that has essentially rested on that stability. The basic unit of political politics themselves, the territorial, the sovereign, and independent nation states, include the oldest and stablest, found themselves pulled apart by the forces of supranational or transnational economy and by infranational forces of secessionist regions or ethnic groups. As true as far as it goes, the collapse of the USSR and the Soviet bloc ended the constraint result from their rivalry and from the need to avoid direct superpower conflict. On the other hand, it eliminated the Soviet role in restraining revolutionary forces, a role which had been dispensable to the United States' control over its own sphere of influence. After a period of unpopularity in the 1990s and 2000s, the world shifted to a hybrid or transitional state between unipolar and multipolar order. There was a single global superpower by default, but it was discovered unexpected limits in Iraq and Afghanistan, and confronting Russia and China as a rising regional power. And people thought that after 1991 there would be no more revolutions. In 1994, anarchism has returned, with the Zapatista revolution establishing a successful anarchist society based on the principles and practice on mutualism and collectivism, and Rojava were more in line with anarchist communism. It shows you that without Soviet influence, revolutions are possible. It only takes China, who is becoming more of a libertarian capitalist element, came in, like just like the United States. It's only the worst case scenario that anarcho capitalist, you know, anarcho fascist, I hate that term, it becomes the dominant position among already existing superpowers.